Good morning, everyone. Thank you to those who have joined us here in Houston in person, and welcome to all of those watching online. My name is Johan Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to welcome all of our audience here today. It's great to be in Houston, as we at the Atlantic Council are keen to take the conversation on NATO and transatlantic security outside of Washington, D.C. to engage new audiences. We have an exciting lineup of events here today planned for you. First will be a panel discussion on the challenges at hand for transatlantic security and NATO and how to strengthen that alliance. Then we will turn to a presentation by Jerry Yavornitsky, CEO and co-founder of Space No, on the powerful applications of AI in an age of geopolitical instability. And finally, we will end with a panel with the President of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, and the President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp. The first discussion comes obviously at a critical time for the transatlantic alliance, which has been challenged by Russia's full-scale invasion, the conflict in the Middle East, and the geopolitical turbulences we've seen in the Indo-Pacific. While the United States and Europe have stepped up to protect friends and allies against these challenges, more must be done. The NATO Summit, which just wrapped up in Washington, D.C. this week, will help shape the transatlantic community's next steps on defense, on deterrence of the alliance, on Ukraine's path towards NATO, on military modernization, interoperability, and much more. This morning's discussion will dive into the challenges that have shaped the alliance since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as well as the takeaways from the NATO summit and the next steps, the follow-through that has to come next for NATO. For our audience virtually, please remember to follow along on social media and submit your questions for our speakers at askac.org, where our moderators will be able to see them, pick them up, and integrate them into what is hopefully an interactive conversation. Now I will pass it over to Dr. Valbona Zinelli, non-resident senior fellow with the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, to moderate the discussion this morning that will kick off our program. So over to you, Val. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jorn. Good morning from Houston, Texas, to all of you joining us in person and virtually, and also good afternoon to our viewers from Europe. It is my great pleasure to moderate the panel today on bolstering transatlantic security and solidarity. We're here in Houston, Texas, to discuss the importance of transatlantic partnership and highlight why protecting it is really crucial and why this special relationship matters. In the face of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the global geopolitical turbulence going from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, countries across Europe have undergone a security and defense paradigm shift in the way that they view security in the framework of transatlantic partnership. From Germany's Zeitenwende to Central Europe's prompt and steadfast and strong support for Ukraine, allies across Europe have taken steps forward to investing not only in their defense, but also supporting Ukraine and strengthening the eastern flank. And in this respect, Czech Republic has been a leader in the transatlantic community and a very strong supporter for Ukraine. As Jorn was mentioning, as NATO Summit, Washington Summit wrapped up yesterday with some very important deliverables, I'm joined here from an excellent panel of experts to unpack some of the most important issues that are related to the future of the transatlantic partnership. I would like to introduce our panel. General Karel Rehka, he is the Chief of the General Staff of the Czech Armed Forces. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Ambassador Daniel Fried, the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow, our very own, at the Europe Center Atlantic Council, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland. Dr. Jan Jureš, Director General of Defense Policy and Strategy Division at the Ministry of Defense of the Czech Republic.
Thank you. Morning.
And last but not least, Mr. J.R. MacDonald, the Vice President for Business Development at Lockheed Martin. Thank you all for being with us today. I would like to start the first round of questions with quick takeaways when it comes to NATO Summit and some of the main outcomes. And I'd like to start with General Rehka. As the long-awaited NATO Summit that was celebrating the 75th anniversary of NATO, as it wrapped up yesterday in Washington, D.C., perhaps you could start off by giving us your primary takeaways on the outcomes of the summit. Do you think that in the 44 paragraphs, the 32 allies had the consensus to bring the main outcomes of the summit?
Well, I think for our security and defense, the real center of gravity of the alliance is the unity. And I think the summit showed the unity. And then individually for the nations, the real center of gravity is the support of our populations at home, because we cannot do anything without that. So I think this was well felt from the summit. And for me as a soldier, because I'm a soldier, obviously the summit is more political level, heads of states level. But for me as a soldier, the deterrence and defense was the major pillar, because the whole summit was mainly three topics. It was the D-Day concept, the deterrence and defense of the alliance. It was the global partnerships, and it was support Ukraine. So for me, the major takeaway was that we get the political support of the heads of states to move the plans forward. And also there was an evaluation of the work which has been done. And I think there was a great work has been done so far, both with the planning, but also with the filling the plans with the real capabilities and capacities, and decreasing the risk on the executability of the plans. And this was confirmed by the heads of states. And there was a strong will showed from basically all allies to move this forward. So for me as a soldier, we are on the right track, and we've got a political support. That's the most important. And also what is very important is obviously all the topics, but also for me, the Ukraine was very important, because I think the support to Ukraine is really crucial for our defense. Not only it sets the rules for the future, it will shape the Russia behavior in Europe, which is very critical to us, but also it buys us the time, basically, and we need the time, and we need to speed up. When we look at it from our national perspective, when we assess the Russia threat and a potential aggression towards the alliance, we don't see any indicators and warnings over the short time, but we see all the indicators and warnings over the long-term preparations for the potential conflict with NATO. And even though it's a long-term, the building defense takes a long time. So it's rather sprint than marathon, what we need to do to prevent the conflict and to build a strong deterrence. So, and what is happening now in Ukraine is very critical to our efforts. So for me, the DDA pillar and the Ukraine pillar was probably the biggest takeaway for me personally.
Well, thank you very much, General. It's very interesting that I was thinking that you'll mention defense and deterrence, but you really started with unity and strategic communication and the importance of talking to different audiences. And I think this is why we're also here today, to be in different places, not only in the United States, but also in European countries, and send the right messages, because we have different audiences. Do you feel that with this unity, we have a broader, I think, before the conflict, Czech Republic and other countries in the eastern flank, there was some sort of regionalization of security threats in Europe, where Eastern European countries were looking more at Russia, and those in the south were not looking at Russia as an immediate security threat. Do you think that we have moved ahead in Europe when it comes to creating this unity and cohesion in the alliance?
I think we did. I think we moved forward. But then on the other side, it's rather natural that, being in different region, you face different threats with different urgency. I think it would be a mistake to look purely at the Russia and to look purely east. Even if you just look at the Russian threat, we cannot contain Russia only in Europe. We also have to look at other regions. For example, it's very worrying what they're doing in Africa right now. That's just an example. So I think that 360 degrees is important. But I think we moved forward because I think no one can really deny that Russia is a real urgent and direct and the most serious threat right now in Europe.
Thank you, General. I'd like to turn to Ambassador Fried. In your opinion, what did the summit accomplish for the transatlantic security agenda, and more specifically on Ukraine? You wrote yesterday that the declaration passed the test of seriousness. Can you explain that more in details?
Well, first, I'm in complete agreement with what General Žaka said. So start from that. NATO faces an aggressive Russia, which is using war and sabotage in Europe to rebuild the Russian Empire. And since there's a debate in the United States about what this has to do with us, I would point out that Americans may not be interested in Russian aggression, but Russian aggression is interested in them. And the NATO summit stood up both political and military support for Ukraine in a way that was credible. Stood up new organizations designed to provide military support for Ukraine, talked about Ukraine ultimately becoming a NATO member in a way that is a lot more credible and serious than a year ago. That's not an easy issue. That's a tough call. But NATO is getting its minds and arms around that problem. And NATO members are now kicking in with vastly increased defense budgets. It's not true that America's doing all the work and that Europeans are just parasites. That's simply false. And the Europeans have been standing up in recent years especially, not because Americans are yelling at them to do it, though we are, but because Putin is an aggressor and they recognize it. I mean, the Czechs, or this Czech government anyway, has been right about Russia all along, and a lot of others have been wrong. And in Berlin and Paris, there's a recognition that, yeah, the Czechs, the Poles, the Balts, the Romanians were right. And so the center of gravity in the alliance has shifted to recognize the danger of Russia. Also, the language in the NATO communique about China was interesting because they pulled no punches, said China is enabling Russia's aggression. This is a problem for us. And you heard Secretary of State Blinken say, China can support Russia and its war against Ukraine and its threats against Europe, or it can have good relations with the West. It can't have both. And a lot of Europeans wanted to separate the China challenge and the Russia challenge as if they are on two different planets. Well, they're not. But NATO recognized that they're not. So the NATO summit was serious. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was solid under tough circumstances. And I'll give credit to all the NATO governments, especially the ones like the Czechs, who contributed to the policy work at NATO.
Ambassador, are you saying that it exceeded your expectations?
Well, my expectations were under control, okay? But it exceeded it.
Okay.
The Biden people, look, give you an example. A year ago, in the run-up to the Vilnius NATO summit, the Biden administration didn't want to talk about Ukraine in NATO. They wanted to shut down that discussion, and you could feel them being dragged into it. This year, they understood that long-term European security seems to require not leaving Ukraine out in a gray zone. Ukraine in a gray zone is a green light for Vladimir Putin. So the language on Ukraine and NATO wasn't dramatically different, but the backstory was very different. So yeah, this NATO summit exceeded my expectations. It was a solid piece of work.
Ambassador, I believe that one of the most important deliverables when it comes to Ukraine was the pledge for long-term security assistance for Ukraine,
Yep.
which is around $40 billion. However, in the media, there were two sound bites that everybody was talking about, and that was the bridge to membership and the irreversible path to membership?
Okay. Look, there's no such thing as irreversibility, okay? But let's not take that literally. Let's take that as a sign that NATO means it. And a bridge to NATO, in my experience with U.S. administrations, and I have some, when a U.S. administration settles on a headline, that's a pretty big deal because you can stuff all manner of good policy initiatives under that chapeau. A bridge to NATO, you can argue, bridge to nowhere, people can mock it, but no, it's actually means we're serious. We don't know quite how we're going to land this, but we are serious, and all credit to the administration. Talking about Ukraine in NATO is a lot tougher than it was getting Poland and Czechia into NATO in the 90s or the Baltics into NATO in the early 2000s. Look, Ukraine is at war. So can we cut NATO and the Biden administration a little slack when they want to think about this real hard? And yet they've moved. So I give them credit. And I think the bridge to NATO is useful. That means something. It means we're no longer trying to push this away. We understand that, hey, the hard way may turn out to be the only lasting way to security, and that's a big deal.
And what's important is that being the summit declaration, that means that all 32 members of NATO, as the general mentioned, agree on that.
Well, that's right. So the Hungarians, I mean, happily, it's not my place to characterize the Hungarian government, but they signed on to it. And this is a very big deal. It means that unity, as the general said, is not just a talking point. That was pretty solid stuff. A far better summit than last year's. You can see it, but the challenges lie ahead. There's a war on in Ukraine. Much depends on the battlefield. And Jake Sullivan put it well. He said the outcome of this war is not written. We don't know how it's going to turn out. We really don't know. But that also means we have the ability to affect the needle, to move things, and therefore the responsibility to do it. And we can. I'm not saying Ukrainian success, Ukrainian victory is inevitable. I'm saying a relative Ukrainian success is possible, and in that possibility lies not only our hope, but our opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Juriš, Czech Republic and more in general Central European countries have played a critical role in supporting Ukraine, but also in bolstering the alliance defense posture. What do you expect for your country and more generally the region for the role to play following the NATO summit?
Okay. Well, first of all, many thanks for having me. It is a pleasure. And I couldn't agree more with everything what Dan has just said. So it will be a very pleasant discussion today. You asked specifically about Central Europe. You are right. We were actually, as the region, spearheading Western support for Ukraine from the early stages of the war in 2022. The first tank, the first helicopter, you name it, actually didn't come from Western Europe or the United States, but they came from Czech Republic, Poland, other countries of Central Europe. So I would argue that we indeed played a crucial role, especially in the initial phase of the full-scale war in Ukraine in 2022, because we believed at the time that the so-called Russian red lines were not for real, and that they must not stop us in supporting Ukraine, and we acted accordingly. So we were not afraid to start supplying military equipment to Ukraine that was at that time seen as still a taboo for most other NATO countries. Anyway, this actually led to a quick exhaustion of our military stocks in the early stages of the conflict. So that's the downside, that actually what we could donate to Ukraine was donated in the early stages of the war, but it, I believe, really helped to create the momentum, and then gradually more and more NATO allies, especially countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, UK, started to contribute, big money, and that was our, I would say, historic role in this war, because we really helped to start the process. And I think it is really crucial to keep explaining the volume of European support for Ukraine for the American audience. When you actually, when you take together, everything European countries have provided to Ukraine, and the value of it, it has exceeded the United States support for Ukraine. So Europe has provided military support for Ukraine worth about maybe 50 billion euros plus 50, 70 billion additional euros as a financial and humanitarian support for Ukraine. So the overall European support for Ukraine has been well over $100 billion. I'm not saying that this shouldn't be the case. Of course, Europe should be supporting Ukraine more than the United States. I mean, the war is in Europe, it's in our neighborhood, it directly impacts our security. So it is a good thing, and it should be the case that Europe is spending and investing more in supporting Ukraine than the United States. But I just would like to emphasize this fact that the burden of supporting Ukraine has been very much shared by Europeans. And of course, we have been immensely grateful for the United States contributions to that common effort.
No, that's a crucial point, because we live in a world of disinformation.
Exactly.
Too, and that has been a part of what the malign actors in Europe or in the United States have been trying to push to the different audiences regarding Ukrainian support. How important is for you that NATO talks about this defense pledge support for 40 billion? Because we know that we have seen bilateral relationships of countries with Ukraine. Politically, how important that NATO puts that in the language of the summit declaration?
Well, I think it is crucial, because NATO taking a bigger role in supporting Ukraine will make it more predictable, sustainable, and politically viable, I believe, because so far Western support for Ukraine has been very much fragmented, I would say, for good reasons. I mean, it was a very fast evolving situation, and each and every country reacted to the situation in its own way. What is now happening is NATO really assuming this greater coordinating role in supporting Ukraine, and it's an important thing. It's not just about the financial pledge you mentioned. It's about this whole new structure to be created in NATO to coordinate and plan support for Ukraine when it comes to assisting them with planning their defense, with coordinating the logistics of the Western support to Ukraine. So there will now be hundreds and hundreds of NATO officers focused on coordinating the Western support for Ukraine in a really, sustainable and predictable way. And I think predictability of our support for Ukraine is what is really crucial now, because Ukrainians need to be able to plan properly when defending their country. And this, by the way, is one of the elements of the famous Czech ammunition initiative as well. That it's not just about getting as many artillery shells as possible around the globe and ship it to Ukraine. It's also about creating predictability in the way that Ukrainians will know that they will be receiving artillery shells, in some, steady, predictable way, that every month there are going to be deliveries of certain volume of artillery ammunition, and that's equally important as the sheer volume of that support.
And this is so important, being predictable instead of just as long as it takes.
Exactly.
So it's important for everyone, Eastern European countries, Ukraine, and the alliance more in general. Dr. Jirish, also you talked about communication. So how important is for Europeans to keep the public, informed in Europe? Because we know that in many Western European countries, it was the pressure of the public that some of the governments changed their perspective also on Russia and similar challenges. So how do we talk to the different audiences in Europe to keep Ukraine up in the headlines?
Well, that's absolutely a crucial thing to do. I completely agree. And first thing to say is that we all need to discard some of the stereotypes about, the regional differences in Europe, because of course you cannot speak of a unified Central Europe. We have countries in Central Europe that are not sharing our view on Russian aggression in Ukraine and are not ready to support Ukraine in the same way we believe it is necessary. But equally in Western Europe, there are huge differences. Just to give you a practical example, I mean, even today, and it may surprise many people. Even today, when you drive around French countryside, you still come across, little villages waving, Ukrainian flags on their town halls. So actually the level of support for Ukraine in many Western European countries is often way higher compared to what is the case in some of the Central European countries. But yes, you are right. The proper communication to our general public is absolutely crucial to sustain the level of our support for Ukraine. The record has been mixed, and it has been different in each and every country. Europe is not a country; it's a collection of rather smallish countries, and each of them actually has different histories and national stories. And you need to adapt public communication to fit, the specific national narratives. I think we have been able in the Czech Republic so far to communicate to our people why supporting Ukraine is in our strategic interest. Of course, most people understand that somehow, naturally. But of course, public support inevitably has been going down. People are getting tired. The economy hasn't been doing very well, so you need to factor that in. But still, in the Czech Republic, at least, support for Ukraine is well over 50%. And of course, the strategic argument is very convincing. People mostly understand that this is really not just about a limited land grab in eastern Ukraine, that land grab in eastern Ukraine is just one small element in the overall Russian imperialist strategy. And if they are not stopped in Ukraine, they will go on. And as has been said, Ukrainians are buying us time, and we must not waste it because it would be a really grave sin if all those sacrifices Ukrainians have been making on the battlefield and in their cities would be wasting by us actually ignoring the need to properly properly boost our defenses.
Thank you, Dr. Juresh. Mr. McDonald, the summit declaration strengthened past NATO language on China, calling it a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, and saying that Beijing continues to pose systemic challenges to the Euro-Atlantic security. What is your perspective on that?
Yes, thank you. I'll start by saying that I'm no longer in the military, and I've never been a politician, so you'll get a decidedly business response from me.
And that's what we need here.
Perfect. I was very surprised to see that the General Secretary call out China directly, and using those words exactly, decisive enabler. And he touched on several of the ways that they are that decisive enabler. And it's no longer just providing support to Russia. It's no longer just providing weapons or using its surrogates like North Korea to provide weapons. It's also asymmetrical threats directly at the Western world, whether that's misinformation, whether that's cyber attacks, or whatever. But what that is doing is it's also showing the importance of global partnerships for NATO, not simply the Transatlantic, not simply Europe, but the importance of gaining, maintaining, and growing partnerships with the Asia-Pacific region. And we saw senior statesmen from New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan attending the conference and working through that. And the key to partnership is to determine that partnership early and to start exercising that partnership in training and in things like interoperability. And as a Lockheed member business development person, I would be remiss if I didn't say F-35 is that perfect tool for interoperability between Europe and Asia, as we will see more than 600 F-35s in Europe in the next 10 years. I read an article this morning that said that number was 850. So if anybody in the audience knows where those other 250 are coming, I'm going to fly there tomorrow. So let me know. But also almost 400 in the Far East at the same time. So the fact that NATO now strongly recognizes the threat it maintains and the importance of partnerships, I found very interesting to be watching from the outside.
Well, that's important because NATO has more partners actually than allies, so that gives it more of an importance. I'd like to follow up with the question regarding European defense industry from your business perspective. How do you see that it has evolved since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? And what are the trends that you're seeing and how it will need to continue to adapt to these new geopolitical realities?
Well, I think that evolution's been going on for a long time. And again, during the summit, the General Secretary made a statement, said that a strong defense for NATO requires a strong defense industry. And fortunately for my company, he then went on to say he believes that F-35 is the perfect example of that brings a strong capability forward, but also brings industry across Europe. I think that many people would be surprised to find out that an F-35, 25% of the content of an F-35 is from European manufacturing. There is a European final assembly and checkout facility, an assembly line essentially in Cameri, Italy. There's maintenance, repair, and overhaul of various sorts all throughout Europe out there. I think in general there is a misperception about industrial participation as part of an acquisition. I think in the past people have thought, well, if you sell something you have to provide some kind of industry, and as soon as you get that done and check it off, your obligation is done. We do not look at industrial participation as an obligation that goes with acquisition. We look at it as an opportunity that goes with acquisition. And what we are looking for are win-win relationships that are long-term. Take the Czech Republic, for instance. Here's a country with an incredibly well-educated young workforce. So how do we tap into that and get those new ideas flowing back on our side, as well as providing jobs and industry into the Czech Republic? We have 11 major projects. The Czech Republic just joined the F-35 team when they signed the letter of offer and acceptance in January of this year. There are 11 projects on the books that are major projects that will bring this industrial participation forward. 2 of them are already signed. We'll sign at least 2 to 3 of them in Ostrava at NATO days, and all of them will be signed by the end of the year. And in every single case of those projects, we believe that this is a long-term investment and that we will get as much out of it as the Czech Republic gains from it. So I think this has been ongoing, but the invasion of Ukraine has really made it come to the forefront. And you recognize that in order to have more industry, you need two things. You need capability and you need capacity. And I believe that the knowledge transfer that we bring as we do these industrial participation projects can then expand the capacity that Europe can provide.
Well, thank you, Mr. McDonald, because you brought us some, important data also when it comes to the industrial participation. I think at some point we overlook the importance of the transatlantic economy. So, how important is this, joint projects or the transatlantic industrial coordination and collaboration for boosting also the transatlantic economy?
Well, as I mentioned, we would not be able to execute the deals that we have in Europe and around the world if we did not have that component of industrial participation. I believe that all of the militaries would gladly buy anything out there that provides better capability, but it is incumbent on the governments to prove that there is also an economic advantage that comes with that purchase. And that then brings the political will of the people along with the military necessity for capability. And I think that then builds on itself and again helps the economy on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you. And talking about spending and talking about money and industrial base, I would like to ask you, General Rehka, so we know that now the European countries are buffing up their defense spending to unprecedented rates. According to NATO, 23 out of the 32 countries have now fulfilled the 2% target, 2% of the GDP target for defense expenditure. And the money that's being spent from the European allies and Canada has increased just in last year by 18%. So we have significant improvements. However, we know that the European industrial base still is significantly underdeveloped. And so how do you, from the perspective of Czech Republic, what should Europe do to boost European readiness while continuing also to prioritize arming Ukraine in this conflict?
I think it's not mutually excluding, supporting Ukraine and boosting our defense, because there are, yes, you need to find a balance. Obviously, you cannot, if you get in low in certain capability or capacity, you have to think twice before you provide it. But then, I know I was getting my thumbs up on some of the military supplies to Ukraine, and many times, I knew that if I used those things, it could be only against the Russia threat. And I knew that basically providing it to Ukraine is the best thing for our own defense. If it was certain mobilization stocks, for example. And when I look at this, how much longer I could sustain it, what type of threat I could use it against, and what it would take, it was just the smartest way to provide it to Ukrainians. So I'm just saying that it's not mutually excluding, itself providing help to Ukraine and boosting our defense. But then yes, you have to find a balance. Obviously, the industrial capacities. I'm not the industry man, so I don't want to talk the business things. But it takes time to build it. It's not going to happen overnight. It's about the long-term orders, but it's not only the orders, because you have to build the know-how, the workforce. The facilities, everything, and it's just like building the reserve component, for example, for the military. Doesn't happen overnight. The same with the industry. So it will take the time. I think we are on the right track. We also need to be honest to ourselves, because sometimes there is still protectionism, among the countries in business. That complicates things. For example, we talk about the standard ammunition for artillery, but we don't have interchangeability of the ammunition, because some producers deliberately, make their own ammunition for their own products. So I think there are things where where from the policy level we should push for the more interchangeability and standardization. Yes, long-term orders is probably the way forward, but I think it's moving forward. And if I just look at our own industry back in Czech Republic, I think we're doing pretty well. We're boosting the capacity right now, but then also we have to kind of realize that the times are changing, because at past, in the Cold War, a lot of the industry was state-owned, or state had a more say above it. Now it's different. Also, these supply chains are interconnected. So you may have ammo production, but then you depend on certain components. You depend on certain raw materials, and the world is globalized, and those supply chains are interconnected. So I don't have the answers. I'm not the business guy, but I think if there is a will to spend the money, if they have the long-term vision, the business from the state, and if the state is a reliable partner, but it's both ways. It's not only state; it's also the business. Then I think it will just happen. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question from the military perspective? Do you think 2% is enough?
No.
Okay.
I'm not that I don't think. I'm sure it's not enough. And it's no wonder, because if you spend for last so many years, 1%, 1.2, 1.5, it's not going to happen like this, that you spend 2% and everything is fine. And quite honestly, it's first we have those huge gaps in capabilities and capacities from the past, because we heavily under-resourced our defenses, but also the prices grew up. So all the plans we made, for example, 2 years ago for these modernization programs, are completely off the books now, of the money, because we need much more money now. And I'm trying to explain it back at home. If you start investing into your defense when the crisis comes, that's the most stupid way to do it, because you don't have enough of it. You have to wait in a line. Everything gets expensive. So, and I'm 100% sure 2% is not enough. And also this 2% game is. I think you need certain milestone, and I think it's good that we have that 2%. Obviously, yes, we wanted to emphasize now in the summit that there's more countries meeting that level, which is about fair burden sharing, and I think it's important, and it is success. I'm not saying it's not, but also there is a danger talking this 2%. Because we also need to talk capabilities.
Exactly.
And actually, if you look at the last summit, what was agreed, we didn't agree on 2%. We said 2% is the minimum, it's the floor, and it's okay for you if you meet all your defense planning obligations. So when you have this NATO defense planning process, and every nation gets the set of capability targets, which is his share to the big pool, which then you use for executing those defense plans. So if you meet all your obligations, then 2% is okay for you. If you don't, you need to invest more. But that if you say 2%, usually for the politicians back at home, not my country, every country, if you say minimum 2%, that means 2%. So yeah, there are dangers, but I'm optimistic. We're moving ahead. There's a huge increase in budgets, including my own country. So I'm optimistic, but there will be times where we will have to be honest to ourselves, and 2% will not be enough.
Exactly, and maybe we're focusing on how much money is spent and not so much how it will be spent. And so, if I might ask you the question, then maybe follow up also with Dr. Jirish. What are the main, in terms of this not burden sharing but also responsibility sharing, what are the main areas where the Europeans should invest in this for the Transatlantic Alliance?
Well, I guess it depends. Obviously, now it's a huge. What we discuss now hugely is integrated air and missile defense. It's a deep precision strike capability, and it's a logistics. But it's also about host nation support, and it's about other capabilities. So it depends on the nation. I don't think it's one formula for all, But in total, yes, air defense, ground-based air and missile integrated defense, deep precision strike, and logistics are quite emphasized recently, and it makes sense because, you know, if you look at the potential of the conflict, for example, further you go from the front line, from the eastern edge of the alliance, that more distant the threat is and more abstract it is to citizens. So if you go to Czech Republic with all our historical experience with you know, Soviets and Russians, that sense of urgency is not there among the population. So what you get in Poland or Baltics, you don't get the same, you know, sense of urgency among our population, and it's natural because we are in the safest, you know, point in our history. We are surrounded by allies or friends, and we are doing very well, and we are prosperous and secure for many years now. So people think everything is okay, but actually, if that crisis happens, for example, between Russia and NATO, many of those weapon systems which are now used in Ukraine can reach our territory easily. So you know, it's kind of a false sense of safety and security.
Thank you. Dr. Juriš, so what's...
Maybe just to add a few more practical things. In 2025, we will have a new package of NATO capability targets. And we all know that it will be massively more demanding and expensive compared to the previous planning cycle, meaning the capability targets 2021. So the estimation is that the capability targets 25 will be between 20 to 30% more demanding and therefore more costly than what we have been dealing with so far. And for good reason, because we need to incorporate in the new package of NATO capability targets a big set of new things that are needed for our collective defense. Essentially what we need to do at NATO is to, and we are doing that, to relearn the art of collective defense, because we lost it. We lost that knowledge and mentality and mindset after the Cold War. And these new NATO capability targets will need to combine both mass and technology, for example, because that's what we see in Ukraine. The war that is going on in Ukraine is actually based on the combination of mass, essentially being able to deploy large numbers of sometimes very primitive military equipment, and the ability to actually employ the newest technologies, artificial intelligence, unmanned systems, and so on. And the NATO's new package of capability targets will need to reflect this. And it inevitably means that it will be very costly, because really you need to have enough money to buy hundreds, if not thousands, of infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, as well as actually to keep investing into technologies and their application in the militaries. What's more, military equipment, military material, and the military itself is not enough for NATO to have a successful and credible collective defense. You need all kinds of non-military enablers for you to be able to have a credible collective defense. And that's what is called enablement of territory, or host nation support, or military mobility. Each of these terms actually means something slightly different, but the point is that you need to be able to deploy your military forces around Europe in the theater you need at the moment, or the secure needs at the moment. And for that you need transport infrastructure, communication infrastructure, you need fuel supply, covering the entire territory of the alliance. You need pre-positioned supplies of essentially everything, not just ammunition, but food, water, again, fuel. And all these things have been massively underestimated over the past 30 years. They were not the priority because we did not believe that actually we would ever need them again. Now we know that we will need them to really have a credible deterrence and defense. The enemy needs to see that actually we don't just have the fancy, military toys, but that we have the mass and that we have the ability to actually deploy and sustain our military forces in combat for a prolonged period of time. So again, to conclude, this will be a huge challenge for the allies to find a proper way of incorporating these, let's say, non-military preconditions of credible collective defense into NATO's defense planning and NATO's new package of capability targets.
You speak about this credible defense and deterrence, and I think resilience there is one of the most important parts of that. And so in the framework of resilience, how do you see going forward cooperation between NATO and the European Union?
Well, that cooperation is absolutely essential. And I would put it in a way that would be received as a controversial thing in some parts of Europe. But I would say that the key role for the European Union in defense and security is enabling NATO's collective defense. Because especially when it comes to these non-military preconditions of credible deterrence and defense, the European Union possesses some of the key instruments that NATO simply doesn't have. The European Union has money to be invested into transport infrastructure, for example. The common market, can regulate communication infrastructure that is dual use.
Yeah, I think 97% of the infrastructure in Europe is dual use.
Exactly, and we could go on and on. So again, when I spoke about those non-military preconditions of credible deterrence and defense, the European Union's role is absolutely indispensable. Resilience specifically, yes, that's the area in which NATO can only provide some guidance, some, coordination, exchanging a best practice, but that's just about it. The rest, when it comes to practical stuff, is up to national governments and up to the European Union.
But as the General mentioned, I think NATO has a role when it comes to the resilience of supply chains. And that's where China enters into the conversation again.
Yeah, but when you specifically mean, for example, Chinese investment into European energy infrastructure or transportation infrastructure, again, this is mostly up to the European Union to set the rules and to enforce the rules. NATO can only come up with requirements that are linked to military requirements. It can provide advice, but really it's up to the European Union to do the business. And actually, I think that maybe contrary to some stereotypes, the EU institutions, especially the European Commission, is now well aware of this role of the European Union. And I'm pretty sure that the new European Commission that will be in place in a few weeks will make this one of the top priorities for the European Union.
Thank you. Mr. MacDonald, from what we were discussing now, from the business perspective, do you see this lack of coordination among European allies that prevent the bloc from achieving also economies of scale, from boosting up defense industry production?
I do, and I wouldn't limit that to the European side. I think that's worldwide. Our industry, the defense industry, like most industries, has been driven over the last years to be as lean as possible. So we have factories that build at 100% efficiency to make it the most affordable that is possible. What that doesn't leave us is a surge capacity when the balloon goes up and all of a sudden we have a major conflict in our hands. And as the General mentioned, we now are suggesting that we need to double that capacity. Well, to do that on the industry side is a fairly long span of time that we're dealing with, 4 to maybe 5 years to rebuild a factory so you can build another 100% of capacity. It requires a very large investment in capital and a commitment from the government that they will support that. And then the part that's hardest is the ability to predict the future. Because if I make that investment and 5 years from now, Putin is gone, is there still a need for that? And how do I get a return on an investment if there's no way to predict the demand in the future? So these are problems that we wrestle with on the industry side as we get these spikes in demand. And that's not just for the large primes like Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Airbus or Leonardo or anybody else. That runs through the entire supply chain. Because in order for us to increase production, it's not just the factory, it's every element that goes into that along the supply chain. And you have to get all of them to believe that there is a potential to get a return on the investment they're going to make.
I mean, the business community, but also government started talking about the needs to move ahead already with the COVID-19 pandemic. So my question is that, are we learning the lessons from the 2 black swan events, if we want to call that? I mean, COVID-19 pandemic and Russian invasion of Ukraine?
We're learning the pain, but we haven't come up with the fix. World War II, World War I, there were national armories that were just producing and producing and producing. That is now privatized. And so we recognize the need, but we struggle as public companies for ways to make those investments that make sense to our shareholders at the same time.
I agree. Thank you. Ambassador Fried, I would like to follow up with you. A lot of conversation also in the transatlantic community is about U.S. presidential elections in November. So what are your recommendations for the European allies? What should Europe do to hedge its best bets and ensure security regardless of the outcome of the elections?
Nice question you asked me. There is a debate in the United States about our international profile. And isolationism or neo-isolationism has been a feature of American strategic thinking for over 100 years. And it's back with us. There are 2 principal schools of skepticism about NATO and about U.S. leadership of NATO. One of them is that the Europeans are rich enough, they should carry the load, Russia's their problem. And a related school is that China is the main threat, therefore we should pull back from NATO and pull back from Europe. The trouble with that is those threats are interlinked, as NATO recognized. And secondly, Europe does need to do more. Europe is doing more. But in the real world, if the United States pulls back, Europe is not now and not going to be for a very long time capable of dealing with its own security. That's a fact. So to say that Europe should do more, therefore we get to pull back, is a debating point. That's worthy of a talk show. That's not worthy of serious strategy. Look, security, this discussion reminds me of 2 sayings. One, security is like good health. You value it when it's gone. And the second is, the only thing worse than a military-industrial complex is not having enough of one. We need it. That debate in the United States is all wrapped up with our politics. And you can sense within the Republican Party and even within Trump world a debate about whether U.S. strategy is better to be neo-Reaganite or neo-isolationists. You can feel it. Speaker Mike Johnson made a strong sort of neo-Reaganite speech at the Hudson Institute on Monday, eve of the NATO Summit. Solid stuff. Mark Thiessen, Republican, he torches the Biden administration on a whole bunch of issues, but if you read his op-ed in the Washington Post on Tuesday, it basically says we need to push back against the Russian threat, we need to back Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So there is a debate on, in the United States and within the right of the United States. And you ask, what can Europeans do? Well, all European governments, all governments around the world need to be able to have ties both to the sitting administration and to the other party. And that's especially so now. And there are a lot of myths in the right that Europeans can easily dispel, like Europe's not pulling its weight. Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, many European countries underinvested in defense. Okay, the Germans are included, and they know it. But some of the European countries, like Poland, is spending 4% of its GDP on defense. The Czechs are spending a lot also. So it's simply not true that Europe is basically a free rider or a parasite. That's not true, and Europeans need to dispel that. The other thing the Europeans should do is recognize that for the United States, China is a big strategic problem. And a year ago, 2 years ago, the Europeans basically said, no, China's a market opportunity for us. It's not a problem, that's the Americans' problem. Well, that won't do. We're in this together. And the flip side of NATO's statement that China is an essential enabler of Russia, mm-hmm. the corollary to that is, yeah, and we Europeans have to help push back on the Chinese. The threat is different. Xi Jinping hasn't started a war of empire, not yet. But you can imagine a deal, a consensus between the United States and Europe and South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, developing, that we are, in fact, all in this together. The challenges are different, but they are not utterly separate. And if I can use the old-fashioned phrase, an all-free world strategy makes sense. It has to be backed up with resources and a sort of world economic view that recognizes that not all supply chains are equal. Mm-hmm. Okay? The Biden people have broken with the old Washington consensus as much as the Republicans. The Biden people talk about friend shoring, which is another way of saying a free world economic strategy. The more your upstream supply chains are in countries that you can't rely on, the worse off you potentially are, so get smart. So you can see, if you subtract, which is impossible to do, but if you could subtract the noise and the screaming and the hair pulling and all of the rest of it, you could imagine an emerging consensus which is neither Democrat or Republican, but sort of weaves together elements of both. And everybody's looking at President Biden and thinking, okay, how does he sound? What gaffes does he make? All the rest of that. But it's interesting that yesterday he put himself in the tradition of Truman and Reagan. I think that's right, and I think that's useful, because there's a bipartisan commonality which we can't hear because everybody's screaming at everybody else. And it's an election season. But the Europeans, I think, can help draw that out. And my old boss, Condi Rice, used to say, the world doesn't get to vote in US elections, but it really does affect them. So I don't mind the Europeans working hard on both sides and all sides of our political divide, and coming to places like Texas and making the point that Czechia is standing up for the free world values, not least because it understands the consequences of doing without them.
Absolutely.
Anyway, look, I went on, but you asked a question that could easily devolve into cheap partisanship, and there's more than enough of that.
But are you saying that when it comes to China, this is going to remain an issue? This is going to remain a national security challenge for the United States threat with any of the administration? Because that's an important message for the Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sure. Absolutely. And the notion that Europe can treat China the way frankly Germany used to regard Russia, as a good market, good economic partner, and that economic ties bring strategic stability, that's an error we shouldn't make twice. It didn't work out that way. We had a whole generation thinking that as China was more integrated into the world economy, its stake in the stability and the functioning of that system would be strategically stabilizing. Now, to some degree that may be true, but
there is a lot of imaging there.
You know, what's happening in the South China Sea?
Exactly.
So history shows that economic interconnectedness is not a guarantee of peace, and if it were, World War I would never have happened. But hey, it kind of did, didn't it? So China will remain a serious security issue, and the fact that NATO has formally recognized that there's a link between the threats to Europe and China is a big deal. Doesn't mean we're there, but I think we're past the denial stage on the part of Europe, and that is a very big deal.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have about 6 minutes to go, and I've received plenty of questions here from our virtual audience, and I'll just summarize them very briefly. The first one is the main takeaways about the conclusions in the NATO declaration regarding neighboring regions such as the Black Sea and the Western Balkans. Does the focus, and also the other one is in the focus on Ukraine and its bridge to membership risk these other critical regions for the alliance? So there is more focus on Ukraine and not so much on the Black Sea and the Western Balkans. That is the question. And then the second question is regarding the evolving domestic politics. I think we addressed some of that. And how do we expect that those dynamics will affect the alliance going forward? And the question is regarding elections, what we saw in the UK, in France, and other countries. So maybe if some of you can address those questions. But I think, Dr. Juris, you had something on China too, you raised.
No, I just wanted actually to add two quickish points on what Dan said. Well, first on transatlantic burden sharing in defense. One of the messages from the summit was that actually for the first time since mid-1990s, when you actually take the defense spending of all the non-US allies together, collectively they will spend over 2% of GDP in 2024. Mm-hmm. I think the figure is like 2.02. Mm-hmm. And this means that we collectively, as NATO allies, have actually achieved what we agreed to achieve, meaning spending more than 2% of GDP. Of course, there are still some European countries not actually spending 2% in 2024, but collectively, without the United States, we have actually made it. Thanks to President Biden, President Trump, and President Putin.
But you mentioned late 90s. Late 90s when there was another conflict in the Balkans in Europe, and that was when the alliance in terms of burden sharing was closest to parity, when the US was only paying 65% and the Europeans 55% of the entire alliance budget. So.
Well, I think this is slightly misleading because, of course, US is the only global superpower, and actually US military engagement is global, unlike European. European defense spending goes only for the defense of Europe. US defense spending does not go entirely for the defense of Europe. This is I would think a bit more complicated. Yeah. But then what I wanted to say is what is the US structure structural role in transatlantic defense and security. The point is that we as Europeans don't expect to be able to outsource our defense to the United States. What we need is American leadership in the alliance, because the problem is that, as I said earlier, Europe is not a single country. It is a collection of smallish countries. And we need a leader, we need a country organizing our collective defense. And no single European country can play this role. The United States is the only member of the alliance that can play the leadership role.
Thank you. General, I'd like to give you the final word, 30 seconds.
Okay, I want to say there's no Russia or China. There's Russia and China. And I think that needs to be understood, because whatever you want to contain the China for, you will not reach it without ignoring Russia and Europe. That's the first thing. Second thing, the GDP of all NATO nations is 20 times Russia. We have depth of 1 billion men and female in uniform compared to 130 million, whatever. We have all the ratios of tanks, combat aircraft, ships, whatever. It's 3 to 4 to 1. So even if we all invest 5% now for several years, we won't be hungry, you know. So we can do it. All we need is leadership and will to do it. And I think we are in the best position. We shouldn't be scared.
And thank you very much. And those are the best words to conclude this panel. Thank you very much to our panelists and to our audience here and virtually. Thank you.
Thank you.